Thanks everybody for joining this experiment. 2 years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, I was approached by Joe DiRenzo to have Siri host this particular event. And I got to tell you, 2 years, that's like 2 years is infinity in the future. Yeah, sure, why not? Let's do it. Let's do something on resilience in maritime. Oh, great idea. And then, of course, I didn't have to think about it for a bunch of months. And then Joe being Joe, he started reminding me, we need to start thinking about this. Okay, so got a team together and started planning. And then it got a ways, and then the virus hit. And so we had some options at that point to how we were going to approach this. One of them would be to just continue planning for an in-person meeting and cross our fingers and hope for the best. Well, I think most people on this conference would agree that was probably not the right idea, particularly for resilience, because that's not a very resilient approach to dealing with it. So another would be just to cancel it, say, oh, we're not going to do MRS this year. And there was not any enthusiasm for that. We were just, fleshing out what were the possibilities. Another would be to move us, if we're doing that, to 2021 and expect to do face-to-face again. But again, the feeling was that we really ought to do something, which meant, well, let's plan for virtual. But I have to tell you that in I guess that would have been late February, early March, there was very little experience by any of us on having these large virtual meetings, but that was the option that seemed to be most attractive. But it did raise a number of questions. One would be, what would be the format? When we have in-person MRS, we have 2-3 intense days. We travel, have intense days, and then we go on. But we didn't have to do it that way. And so we have an experiment of spreading it out over a week. And so, each of us can participate in MRS such as we can, and then do other things during the day as well. So, that's an experiment. For me, one of the large questions was, what would be the platform that we would use? Have had lots of experience with a number of platforms with teleconferences in various ways, but to have a platform that was going to, accommodate lots of people in a conference kind of setting, we didn't know how that was going to go, and we delayed a decision on that for quite a while. And so I have to say it's going to be an experiment. I also have to say there was no one thing that jumped out and said, me, this is it. So we will see how it works, and we hope it works well. We thought that we could take advantage of the situation of the virus and the impact it was having to try and steer our discussion around resilience in the face of, you might think of it as black swan events. And not necessarily, it wasn't going to be the COVID-19 MRS, but certainly by the time that we've met now, we've had some experience with things related to changes in the way we've done business because of the virus, and thinking about resiliency in the face of these large disruptions. And so, I hope we see that. I expect we'll see that in the panels, in the discussion, because it really is a unique opportunity for us all to think about resilience in the maritime system in the midst of an event that really requires resilience. It gave us not just an opportunity, but a necessity to think through how we would approach presenting this, and asked ourselves, is there a way of taking advantage of the technology? When you got lemons, you make lemonade. And so are there things that we could do with this MRS that take advantage of the fact that we're going virtual? And the answer to that is, I think, yes. Both for the purposes of leaving a permanent record and the purposes of having some resilience in the face of potentially spotty network behavior. We've opted in the program to have a piece of it be pre-recorded. And that will be broadcast out of the University of Illinois, which has got great connectivity, guaranteed great connectivity, knock on wood. And so if the presenter was having some issue on this morning, then we didn't have to sort of wait until he had enough bits per second to make the presentation. And then to have an interactive piece afterwards. So this is what we're doing with the keynotes, a pre-recorded piece with interaction by you all. We're doing that with the panels, again, a pre-recorded piece, and then lots of interaction and discussion. And Admiral Parks will give you some instructions on how we go about the interaction piece. We'll save that till the end because you need to remember. If I say it now, you'll nod your heads up and down, and then you'll forget. Or at least speaking to me, I would forget, and so we'll save that. We'll save that to the end. There are benefits to this, and that is, these videos that are being made are leave behinds, and in fact, we'll have a YouTube site up where the recordings that we've made will be available, and we will have transcribed them as well. So transcripts for this will be available. And so we're going to have a different kind of record of the event than we've had in the past. And I think that that'll be interesting. And a number of people on the steering committee expressed interest and enthusiasm for having these videos be available for use in education, for example. So we think that's sort of an exciting benefit of approaching things the way that we're approaching. Another benefit has to do with student involvement. Because we're virtual, that means that there's no travel that's involved. And that opens the possibility for way more students to be involved, owing to their schedule, owing to budgets, than have been involved in the past. And we think this is a really good thing, and I'm very excited about that. And I want to thank Kevin Clements from University of Houston of taking on the student poster organization job and doing a really outstanding piece of that. And I'm certain that we have more students involved in that than we've had in years past, which I can say with some confidence because I was always doing the organization for the last 3 years on the student posters. And so I am very much impressed in what it is that Kevin has done. So what's coming up today? We're going to have a keynote by Professor Steve Flynn. Tomorrow we'll have a keynote by Rear Admiral Donna Cottrell, and on Wednesday we'll have a keynote by Rear Admiral Michael Fossum. We have panels today. We have one on resilience in maritime infrastructure, and so that's going to be thinking about what are the issues in the larger overall interconnected space of maritime with respect to resilience, and a very exciting panel of folks that'll be speaking their minds on that. And we'll have also a panel on maritime resilience and the human element. And again, so this is key, the resilience that we have in any system. Some of it is engineering, a lot of it is people. That gets down to, training, for example. What is it that how do we prepare folks for resilience, and how do we prepare folks for resilience in the face of changing technologies, for example. So there's a lot of potential and really great problems to talk about in that space. It's time to give thanks. The CIRI team that's been doing this has been doing really an outstanding job, I like to say, because it's true, I'm just the talking head. I'm the director of CIRI, and I made the decision that we'll do this, and every now and then I make the team's lives complicated by paying attention to details and say you ought to do it this way. But by and large, this program is put together and organized. The meeting has been organized by their efforts. So Andrea Weitzel has been the point of contact. She's the lady that has made everything come together. She's had assisting her, Katie Balch. And for the communications and the very nice program layout and such, we have Kim Gudeman. Randy Sandone is the executive director of CIRI, and so he's staying attention to what the people at CIRI are doing. And then there's outstanding staff at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. There's Mike Miller and Chad Martin and Daniel Pano. And this was Andrea's idea was, and a good one, to say, hey, I have an idea. Let's not try to do the IT stuff and the web stuff all by ourselves. Let's find some experts. And I said, that's a good idea. And so that's what we're doing. And so we're expecting things to go swimmingly. That means, among other things, that we're going to be spending money. The money for that is coming from the Department of Homeland Security. The program manager for CIRI is Gia Harrington, and she's very keen on seeing what it is that we're doing for the Coast Guard, who is, of course, is one of the components of DHS. So thanks to DHS for supporting this. This would not happen. This is the 11th offering of MRS. It would not have happened if the indefatigable and inimitable Joe DiRenzo hadn't been steering, coaching, exolling, and all those things. And those of you that know Joe know exactly what I'm talking about. Behind the scenes, he put together an outstanding program committee that had 20, 30 people. I don't know. We had meetings. That's one thing. I love Joe. I really do. But he likes meetings, and I avoid meetings. And so, but he has meetings for this when we really have to. And we had a number of really good meetings with the program committee that help shape the program as you find it, and lots of great discussions on what it is that we should talk about and how it is that we should talk about it. And then also wonderfully for me, because I get to talk at the beginning, and then I get to let other people do stuff, and that is the Master of Ceremonies, Rear Admiral Mike Parks, has graciously accepted the job of making it all happen and steering us from one event to the next, and really appreciate that, Admiral Parks. And so I will hand the talking stick over to you, sir, and take it away.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much. And when you say steering, I'm a little concerned. We will do our level best not to run aground, since I'm currently on the shores of Lake Erie, and but I want to say thank you, Doctor, to you and your team for the great work that you've done. And I think everyone on this call, as I look at all the participants and scroll down through the list, there's probably everybody that thinks Joe DiRenzo owes them money. So I think that we are all in the same boat there. It is a pleasure to have been associated with this MRS for over a decade. And it's just an honor to be part of this. And I will do my level best to be as brief as humanly possible for me, which those of you that know me know is not easy. But the first thing I get to do is really a privilege and an honor, and I am just so disappointed we're not doing this in person, because my dear friend Steve Flynn there could not be a better person to keynote and kick off this conference than Dr. Stephen Flynn. He is just an incredible expert in this area. He's also the founding director. And I'm not going to read everybody's bios for everybody's benefit. They're all in your program. Please make sure to look at them. But, Steve is the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, which is something that, that's a major university-wide research effort which helps inform and advance resilience. And resilience is a topic that is obviously top of mind in a lot of people's world right now. But I can tell you that Steve Flynn, author of numerous books on the topic, has been thinking about this since well before we were sitting on a porch in Block Island in early 2000s, as he was getting ready to write America the Vulnerable. And he is truly gifted, and I think what's going to happen is we're going to have a 30-minute video. We'll go off video, let that roll, and then I'll come back and we'll kick it over to Steve for a Q&A, and I'll talk to you about that when we get to that point. So unless, Steve, you want to make any introductory comments of the video, I'll turn it over to you, my friend.
No, just to thank you very much, Mike, for this, and it's been wonderful to reconnect with you, and thanks for all your extraordinary leadership in the Coast Guard and now with the Red Cross, and putting resilience into practice. Puts a real skip in my step. So delighted to be here and looking forward to the question and answer portion after we get through with the presentation. Hi, I'm Stephen Flynn. I'm a professor of political science and the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeast University. And I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this important symposium. It addresses my roots, which are actually started my career as a Coast Guard officer, went to sea at the start of that career, commanded a couple of vessels, and increasingly found myself gravitating to both the world of public policy and into academia. I've been at Northeastern University since 2011 and have been the director of the Global Resilience Institute starting in 2017. And I want to talk with you today about the resilience imperative that hopefully will increasingly inform how we think about risk and manage risk within the maritime realm. I start first with an example of essentially anti-resilience, though that will strike many people as initially something that is a model of modern efficiency. What you're looking at here is an aerial photo of, on the very left of the screen is Newark International Airport. Toward the middle is the New Jersey Turnpike. Directly adjacent to the New Jersey Turnpike is the railhead that runs freight cargo up into the Northeast. And directly adjacent to that is Port Elizabeth, the largest container terminal on the East Coast. Engineers brilliantly put it all together in about an area of just a little over a mile, connecting the airport tarmac to the seaport. This supports great efficiency so that you can move cargo from a plane to a train to a truck to a ship and all other variations thereof. The anti-resilience piece, of course, of this is a built-in fragility by all this connectedness. If I disrupt this one place, for instance, with a bomb in a box in a container in Port Elizabeth, I have the potential of disrupting rail and the surface transportation traffic, as well as a major airport on the eastern seaboard. And this impact is not just felt by New York City and Newark, but is impacts all across the Northeast, since this is the logistical throat that essentially feeds commerce into much of the northeastern part of the United States. Thinking about resilience, therefore, has a starting off point, recognizing the built-in fragility of great efficiencies and dependencies that we generate. So what is resilience? The term that we use out of the Global Resilience Institute is actually adopted by the one that's still with us here, survived a transfer of administrations, but goes back to 2013 with Presidential Policy Directive 21. What I like about the definition is it really emphasizes that resilience is not just what you do after something goes bump in the night, but it's very much about how we prepare for changing conditions, that we want to design things to withstand disruption. And when disruptions happen, we want to adapt to the reality as well as recover rapidly from them. And we're somewhat agnostic about the source of the disruptions. Resilience is needed to respond to deliberate attacks, to accidents, to naturally occurring threats or incidents. What you're trying to secure is the continuity of critical functions provided by infrastructure and systems. And so whether it comes from a naturally occurring hazard or an accident or a man-made intentional attempt, the overarching goal should be to safeguard that function. And that's why resilience should be front and center of everything we do when we think about issues like security. A little advertisement about the Global Resilience Institute. We have this ambition of supporting this grand challenge of advancing societal resilience around the world. Our key is the approach that we take is very much about building an ecosystem for within the academy, transdisciplinary research collaborations, but really dealing outside the academy, connecting with industry, government, communities, non-governmental organizations, where the goal of this external outreach is to accelerate the speed at which we discover solutions and get them applied into the real world. And this makes me particularly excited to talk at this forum, given its focus and its importance. I use this slide to really highlight that why resilience is not because there are necessarily more threats and hazards today than there have been in the past. There always have been threats and there have always been hazards that have been very disruptive. What has made this qualitatively an imperative for us to focus on, to make it front and center of when we think about how we manage risk is that we're hyper-connected. That's a hyper-connected. Every time we make a connection, we create a dependency. And when we make multiple connections, we start to generate interdependencies. That creates the risk of when we have what used to be a localized shock, now cascading in far more disruptive and destructive ways. Now, the map here captures global transportation networks, but interestingly, of course, what we're really seeing acceleratively over the past decade is the Internet of Things, the connected of all of the critical infrastructure and functions, and many of the things common to our daily lives. We're building that into electronic connections. And this has grown explosively from a little over a decade ago, virtually nothing being connected, to a expectation, a projection that by 2025, just 5 years from now, we'll be at somewhere around 39 billion devices connected. And these are everything from smart home devices, wearables, connected vehicles, smart TVs, all the things that are almost ubiquitous to our lives are becoming connected. Again, these connections create efficiencies, but they also create dependencies. Therefore, when we have disruptions, are likely to cascade in more destructive and in more costly ways. The heart of resilience imperative is built around this recognition that sectors and assets don't stand in isolation. They're a part of systems. And this graphic from 2009 captures the story well, that while we have energy up at the top right corner, basically energy feeds into all the critical systems that we have, and interconnectedness, banking and finance, water, communications, transport, government services, all these are interconnected and interrelated. And we're organized, though, however, around usually safeguarding assets or safeguarding infrastructure and systems. What we really need to be doing is looking at the totality of systems, understanding this complex interdependency challenge, and then devising strategies to mitigate its risk. Reason for doing this as well is it's getting really expensive. Even before COVID-19 disrupted the global economy in ways that we're still trying to get out in front of, and which, of course, is still unfolding. The estimates by the World Bank were we were averaging about $300 to $500 billion a year in annual worldwide economic losses due to major disasters. So it's not, again, that disasters are becoming necessarily more frequent, though climate-generated ones, that seems to be the case. But the reality is, because we're so hyper-connected, what used to be local now becomes all in global. A disease outbreak in Wuhan, China, very quickly, within a matter of weeks, impacts the entire global economy. That's what's unique and what makes it a qualitatively important imperative to focus on resilience. Now, as a counterexample of this, to sort of put it in context, while qualitatively this has been changing over the last century, is the story of Isaac Storm, the storm that hit the hurricane, Category 4, that hit Galveston, Texas on September 9th, 1900. This is actually the storm of the largest loss of life natural disaster in U.S. history. The estimates are that about 8,000 people perished that day. Every house in the city sustained damage, with at least 3,600 of them destroyed. But here's the interesting thing. The rest of the country didn't even know that this had happened for another day because the telegraph lines to the mainland had been knocked down. If you were in Galveston, Texas that day, it was a biblical day of destruction. For everybody else, it was almost a non-event. If we fast forward, though, to 115 years when we have Hurricane Harvey, the loss of life is relatively modest, but the cost is in the tens of billions of dollars when we disrupt the Houston shipping channel and the greater metropolitan Houston area and all the effects that it impacted Hurricane Harvey had as a result of flooding that was associated with the hurricane. Again, it's the hyper-connectedness that makes resilience such an imperative today. We can start to see that the other element here where these start to get interrelated is the fact that we are essentially, with the wildfires really highlighting this in the Western wildfires here most recently, that we really have this twinning of the combination of climate change, which is increasing the intensity and the frequency of the storms with the built environment encroaching on the wildlands and therefore creating this interdependent hazard. This is where the hazard itself is becoming more dangerous and more likely to be frequent. So we know, for instance, with energy infrastructure, it was a source of the wildfire outbreaks. And at the same time, of course, it becomes a victim of these outbreaks. As we push infrastructure into areas where we have this risk, and it can contribute to the risk and obviously be impacted from the risk. But this is not new. This slide here shows the city of Boston through its various evolution. The brown part is the original footprint of the city of Boston, basically what the Pilgrims saw when they showed up in the early 17th century. Over the course of primarily the last 150 years, but very much so as an evolution that happened over the life of Boston, we essentially took this hilly peninsula and essentially brought a lot of soil in and pushed it around to build up what became the modern footprint of the city. The challenge here is that what we're doing here by moving this built environment into, in this case, the maritime world and ecosystem, we created real fragility to flooding, because it turns out we put most of the industrial landscape on the new areas where we built in Boston. And what happened here, for instance, there are 30 substations for power located largely in low-lying areas, as this illustrates here. When you added more land to the area, you built it just a little bit above high tide. And so these are low-lying spaces with built infrastructure. So now when we add climate change and the risk of rising sea level and storm surge associated with more intense hurricanes, you can start to see how we can have an accelerated risk, as necessitating, again, a much greater focus on the resilience imperative. So I want to highlight a couple of these in particular to show this interdependency issue. So one of the areas that we've been looking at in Boston area is the vulnerability of the energy infrastructure located right on the harbor. And the Mystic Generating Station is the largest power plant for the city of Boston. And it is fed by natural gas, which is actually shipped in by liquefied natural gas. And that's a neighbor, the District Gas LNG terminal is located there. When we see a storm scenario highlighted by the blue, virtually both these key facilities are put underwater. And we're not talking just about rising water like a bathtub. We're also talking about debris that gets pushed into these locations, making it much more difficult to recover them, and a risk of real damage that may happen to these facilities. So with the power requiring natural gas, if we lose the shipping channel, disruption to the waterfront, and we can't receive the shipments, then there's no source of essentially the fuel to provide the power plant. And a loss of the power plant, of course, has cascading effects in lots of other ways as well. Just as the picture, just where we are here, this captures where the power plant is, as well as the LNG terminal. If we take a look, though, at transportation, one issue is an electromechanical system, which is the transit system for the city of Boston. The T is actually driven by electricity, and its power farm is located on the waterfront in South Boston. And it has a backup power in the event of the grid going down, but the source of that backup power is two gas turbine, jet turbine engines that are co-located on the facility, both likely to be impacted severely by the storm scenario. So again, the built environment is in an area that's quite vulnerable. It's becoming more vulnerable with climate change. The disruption of that power station is to disrupt the transit system, and the loss of power is going to disrupt every other sector as well. This is the actual photo of the power station for the MBTA, the Mass Bay Transit Authority. Putting this all together, we saw it most play out here in the story of Puerto Rico. Hurricanes have hit Puerto Rico through its entire existence. But what made Maria particularly devastating, where the effects are still lingering 3+ years later, is because all the critical lifeline systems failed concurrently, in part because they were all interconnected. When you lost power, you lost your cell sites. The backup generators for the cell towers weren't available because there wasn't the transportation or the fuel available to move to bring it to those sites once the on-site fuel was expended. That's because of damage to the port, which meant it was impossible to get the fuel shipments. And even when the fuel shipments started to arrive, there was no local trucking to be able to move it around because there weren't truck drivers to do that. Then you had the loss of water, in part because of lack of power for pumps. Also, the wastewater systems that overflowed, causing environmental damage. The washed out roads prevented the transport to repair the water system. On it goes. The key here is that it's this interdependency of these key systems that leads to catastrophic failure, which is why resilience has to be such a critical imperative. So why aren't we more resilient? In fact, why to some extent are we becoming more brittle and fragile? It's really because what we've identified with the work that we're doing at the Global Resilience Institute is because there are these 5 substantial barriers that are keeping us from becoming more resilient. First is basically risk illiteracy. You can't get people to be particularly motivated to do things to protect themselves from something if they don't believe it's ever going to happen. The challenge we have of trust and understanding of science and so forth that is now pervasive is really undermining a foundational element of building resilience. The second is we design things for efficiency, not for resilience, as some of the illustrations I provided earlier have highlighted. The rewards, and this is where the other things are, for that efficiency. There isn't much. In fact, there are often disincentives for investing in resilience because it may be seen as raising costs, at least in the short term. There's also inadequate governance frameworks. The issue of interdependency, cross-sector, cross-jurisdiction is a nightmare from a bureaucratic standpoint. When you get to private-public mix in this as well, that also affects our ability to come up with comprehensive system-of-systems solutions. And finally, we're not really training or educating folks to really think in the resilience context, again, which requires a really systems of systems thinking and understanding, the ability to move from engineering and science across understanding policy and economics and being able to understand the community and the social drivers that are critical for success. So when we put resilience in the practice, we have to think about overcoming those barriers and doing it in a way that's organic, that basically is ongoing. It's not something we just do or plan for when things go bump in the night. We always have disruptive risk. Even if you're not directly impacted, the likely that you're connected to something that will be disrupted is growing acceleratively. So the best way to think about this is as a resilience cycle. Work by my friend and colleague at the Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. It's highly talks about it as a resilience cycle, where we start, where we prepare, we develop strategies to mitigate. We have a shock represented by the bolt, the lightning. We have to respond. But when we recover, we don't just bounce back, we bounce forward. We adapt. That feeds into preparation and mitigation. It's an ongoing process. And it's something we do before a disaster happens. Ideally, we practice some resilience during a disaster, because we want to make sure that, in fact, the response doesn't actually undermine recovery. So we have to be thinking about response in those terms. And we have to obviously adapt it as a part of following disaster as we invest in adaptation and mitigation. So what are we trying to do, though, when we talk about bolstering infrastructure resilience like the maritime transportation system? The stepping off point that I like people to focus on is the breaking things down and looking at around function, where you have to really break out these 3 sort of core elements of being an infrastructure being able to perform. One is it has to have essentially the elemental capacity to produce the function. And then it has to produce an essential function, which I'll define here shortly. And then there's a full or normal function. There also are attributes of resilience. So it's not just one size or one approach that fits all. These include, which I'll explain shortly, cushionability, resistance, robustness, redundancy, and adaptiveness. Collectively, our goal should be to develop these attributes as this menu of essentially of approaches to allow us to be able to deal with disruptions with the least possible loss of function and the quickest recovery and the sustainability of that effort when we have those disruptions. So what is elemental capacity? This is basically what has to be the prerequisite system conditions that must be in place for the infrastructure system or network to produce its function. For instance, you can't work in a modern operating room
without a functioning HVAC system. So the HVAC system can't provide medical care, but is elemental to essentially providing that operating room. So that becomes an elemental capacity that we have to identify. Or electrical power at a retail filling station. We can't get gas out of the tank underground without the pump, and the pump requires electricity. So the elemental capacity that gets access to fuel is the power that makes that possible. Thinking about elemental capacity is a starting point to recognizing where risk may lie, but also where our efforts should be focused around resilience. The next is to understand essential function as distinctive from full function in two ways. First, it has to be there to meet the critical needs of its users. And second, the essential function has to support recovery. You have to have just enough function, basically to keep the other lifelines alive and be able to support recovery. So examples are, we can have an airport continue to take emergency landings and takeoffs and provide emergency relief without all the workings on the ground. You need a functioning air traffic control capability to talk to the incoming planes. That's essential function. Flying all the commercial flights each day, that gets us to full function. A water utility has to be able to provide enough water to support, let's say, a coolant system for power generation. Okay, that's got to be essential, recognized as such. When we get to full and normal function, this is where the expectation is for users that they expect a level of service, or in order for them, for privately owned infrastructure, for it to be economically viable. So a hospital wants to be able to perform elective surgeries, which is an important source of its revenue. An airport wants to be able to schedule daily landings and takeoffs because it's the fees and it's the service that makes that airport function well. So the strategies, though, of how we manage and make those systems more resilient, the first one I highlight is cushionability. And this is the capacity to essentially support graceful degradation of non-essential function. Again, if we distinguish between essential and full, we should be able to live without some of the full function to get us in a less exposed place. So hospitals often evacuate non-critical patients to make additional beds and medical personnel, for instance, to respond as they did in the COVID-19 emergency to a disease outbreak. Highways are closed down to all but non-emergency vehicles prior to a snowstorm so that the snow removal operations could go much more smoothly. So we degrade the function before the storm so we have more function post the storm because we can clear the roads that much more quickly. This captures the concept of cushionability. The next is the notion of resistance. I don't have to protect myself from everything. If I can steer the hazard away from where it can do or cause harm to elemental capacity or disrupt essential function. So for instance, if I do a fire line around, let's say, a critical facility like a substation, even if there's wildfires in the area that I can't stop, it will veer away from that substation. That becomes a resistance strategy. Or when in case of flooding, instead of just abandoning a urban area that's on the coast, if I can, when the flood comes, steer the water to places where will have the least amount of impact, and when the sea surge retreats, will basically drain away, and not put exposed things that are would be much more harmful, that would be a strategy for resistance. Now, as I look at robustness, these are the more traditional forms you often think about in terms of hardening of a hazard. The key is what I have to harden or protect is the elemental capacity and essential function. I don't have to make everything resilient. I have to make robust the elemental capacity, the essential function. So this is, for instance, installing backup generators on high floors so they won't be damaged by storm surge. That's a more robust strategy. Or I could construct a flood wall around a low-lying electrical substation. Essentially, I'm hardening against that hazard. The other approach is simply have a spare. If it's too costly to protect something, have a backup. And this, again, is for elemental capacity and essential function. So a classic of this is backup data processes located in other regions. So if there's a power outage, I don't lose access to that data. Sufficient protective clothing on hand at a hospital to support and provide emergency medical care in the event of disruption of the transportation supply system. Just-in-time systems, as we found out with protective equipment, doesn't work very well when everybody is being disrupted at the same time. And the last one is the adaptiveness. Adaptiveness is essentially designing things to fail, but to fail gracefully and to have a regenerative ability to come back. So one way I can think about adaptiveness is, let's say I'm putting a flood protective barrier, and I'm not quite sure how high it needs to be over the next few decades. But if I build a foundation enough to support, say, a 12-foot seawall, even though I may only need 4 for the next 20 years, then I can adapt that seawall as the hazard evolves. I also could be thinking about distributed energy systems that basically decentralize the generation and storage of electricity to island a capability during disruptions and then reconnect itself in a network that gets the efficiencies of the old mainframe systems. That would be a much more adaptive and therefore more resilient system. So putting resilience into practice, how do we start to do this? Well, first, again, an overarching goal has to be that we're thinking about doing this before things go bump in the night. We also got to be thinking about resilience during a disruptive event. So we, again, don't want to do things in response that can undermine recovery. And we want to also, of course, think about resilience as bouncing forward and adapting after an event. So pre-disaster, what are the kinds of things we can do and must do in the maritime realm as well as more broadly in other infrastructure systems? One is to develop models and conduct simulations so we understand this issue of dependency and interdependency. We have to understand how, when we have a shock, it will cascade off of things that matter, that are important to us. We have to support the ability now, understanding those disruptions, what different decisions can do and the cost-benefit approach to different resilience designs. What if I choose a strategy of redundancy versus robustness? Or if I choose a strategy of resistance or cushionability? What are the trade-offs there? And then we should put all our work to test by contingency planning and exercises. The goal has to be to prioritize and identify the resilience attributes that should be deployed to safeguard and rapidly recover the elemental capacity and the essential function of the infrastructure systems or network. Again, not all function is equal. We want to devise policy and market-based incentives to make sustainable investments in these attributes of resilience design. And then we need tools and processes to provide situational awareness. If the things we're worried about happen, we would like to have early warning of that, so it allows us to be more surgical in how we respond to these events to safeguard, again, elemental capacity and the function. Following a disaster, our goal should be to direct limited resources to support the response, recovery, and adaptation. First things first are to restore elemental capacity and essential function. And then we undertake actions to restore full function. And very, very importantly, we need to learn from the event. This needs to be organic to how we deal with every disruptive event. Should have a morning after look and assessment that can inform adaptation, inform mitigation as we go forward. One key final point here I really want to drive home is increasingly we're seeing, and this verified in the marketplace as well as a recognition in the public policy realm, that resilience is actually becoming a competitive advantage. It's not just something we have to do because we're forced to do it by hazards and the disruptions that come with them. The reality is there is no hazard-free place in the world, especially, again, as we become more connected. So people and companies that have a choice, that have the means, they're going to live in places that aren't risk-free because there aren't any, but are places that are demonstrably resilient. They're going to invest in companies and enterprises that are resilient, and they will abandon those that are not. So I have this photo here from Mexico Beach, Florida, as an illustration of we actually know how to build resilient structures. In this case, it was a robust structure that was able to withstand a Cat 4 hurricane, where all around it, you just see foundations of housing that was wiped out. We know how to do it. We're not doing it. We're not doing it because the incentives aren't there often for doing it. It's not because we don't know how to do it. And the key here is we have to think about understanding that basically building the house at the additional cost, about 5% additional cost, makes sense over the long run, and it will put you in a better competitive position. We also need to think about resilience as something we bake in every time we spend a dollar, especially a public dollar. We should be thinking about, when we're doing economic development, designing things for resilience. And we certainly post a disaster, when we bring in resources to recover, it should be to build back better and smarter. One of the things that we're starting to do in Boston is to think about designs that are essentially can coexist with rising sea level and storm surge ridge. Designing, for instance, first floors that could absorb that water coming in and going out as open atriums that actually create more sense of a community. It's possible to coexist in risk environments here, and this is the key to how we need to think about moving us forward. So how do we advance maritime infrastructure resilience? I want to just offer these concluding points. We have to do three things concurrently. First, we need to be conducting research that informs infrastructure resilience and community resilience. This is an ongoing effort. We've got to get smarter about how to do this along the ways that I laid out. We got to raise our risk literacy. We got to improve designs. We got to think about incentives. We got to address the issues of governance, and we have to address the education and training. At the same time, we need to support early and widespread adoption of resilience applications, tools, and protocols by establishing best practices, and where appropriate, reinforce those by requirements of standards and codes. And then we have to look for market-based and public policy incentives to adopt infrastructure and community resilience best practices. So in conclusion, resilience requires a deep understanding of hazards and risk across infrastructure sectors at the community regional levels. It requires us to have a systems of systems perspective. The goal should be for companies and communities to bake in resilience in terms of how they operate critical systems and function. What we know about large-scale disasters, and we're certainly seeing play out with COVID-19, is they're always regional and multi-sectoral, and they require robust cross-industry, cross-jurisdictional collaboration. And resilience is increasingly a competitiveness issue. I hope this is useful and framing up an understanding of resilience as an imperative that the maritime community needs to embrace more broadly, and certainly a key focal area, I would argue, the focal area for dealing with maritime risk going forward. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Steve, for that great talk on resilience. That is just awesome, and thank you for that. And I'd like to open up the questions to you. And what I'd like people to do is, if you would raise your hand, you should be able to do that by clicking on the little icon that says raise your hand. And if I can figure that out, I'm sure all of you smart people on this screen can do that. And then we'll call on you if you'd like to. Please put yourself on video, and we'll go from there. And while we're waiting for people to figure all that out, Steve, I have a quick question based on our long years of friendship and our work together. I guess one of the questions I'd like to just ask you to kind of tee it up is, what do you think is going to be our biggest challenge to overcome? You've made a very compelling case for the need for an appreciation of resilience and action to take that. What do you think is going to be the challenge for our country to become a more resilient nation?
What I really think it is boiled down to almost the dollars and cents. It's what I really had animated to Northeastern University 9 years ago, and leaving the public policy realm, where I was exhorting to do this at in Washington in the think tank world, was the devil's in the detail in terms of how do you actually make things resilient. And what's great working in a university environment where you can have access to engineers and scientists and social scientists and economists is that you can get those details worked out. But what became very clear as this evolved, and I started this work at Northeastern in 2011, was you can accumulate these best practices in the academy, and nobody's going to do them if there isn't the incentives for them to adopt them. So I think one of the biggest challenges is, are we going to make the investments? Are we going to tie economic recovery assistance? Are we going to tie economic development dollars? Are we going to look for market-based incentives, insurance, and so forth to actually drive the adoption of those best practices? Because the core to this is we have to scale these solutions. And right now we've got too many sort of pilots, one-offs, kind of like I tried to illustrate with that house in Mexico Beach. Really cool, but it's one and alone. And so scaling with the pace that we have, right? We don't have like decades to sort this stuff out. We're in a race right now with the kind of price tag we saw, going here, $500 billion a year of disruption. That's pre-COVID. So how do we compress the cycle between discovery and development of those best practices and widespread adoption, it's clearly going to be because we have the drivers, economic drivers, to make it happen at a scale that's meaningful. And that's a really hard task.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Steve. Great talk, as usual. So, one of the things that one of the places resilience has come up a lot during the pandemic is resilience of supply chains. And it's been highlighted how dependent we are on some foreign sources. And there's a lot of discussion about onshoring as opposed to offshoring, and building more infrastructure and supply chain infrastructure at home. So, and of course, resilience in general about supply chains is a major issue, which of course affects the maritime domain dramatically. So, what do you think about onshoring as one way of establishing more resilience?
I think it's certainly going to be, and now, of course, is getting more attention. When you look at truly critical things like medical supplies and how much, PPE that we have available, and it turns out you have single sources or sources that are all offshore. And when we saw this is when there's global demand because there's a global pandemic, doesn't look so smart. But the driver for that, again, was efficiency, low cost, and the assumption that the global supply chain system and primarily the underlying transportation logistics system could make those available when I need it. So I don't need to have them on my shelf. I don't need to have them, in inventory. I can just order them up
if I get warning, and then what we've seen is that not working. So the issue is really about redundancy and making, again, not everything has to be there. But if you talk about, as I tried to lay it out, well, what is the elemental capacity I need to provide emergency care? What does that function look like? That is, how many people do I need to have? It turned out we were focused very heavily, for instance, on PPE, focusing on, of course, doctors and nurses. But boy, you needed it at nursing homes and all the people who worked at that nursing home who were providing administrative and support, janitors and so forth. And none of those were really on anybody's radar screen until we had the pandemic break out here. So again, the driver here about ideally modeling these in advance, simulating them, is to identify these vulnerabilities. And that certainly was happening in the supply chain world. But bottom line, I think resilience increasingly is asking us to think about creating more localized sources that, or thinking about the value of localized sources at least. We're seeing this, interestingly, in the hospitality restaurant dining area here, the farm to table, that kind of local connection. Well, those turn out to be the most resilient in the pandemic here, in terms of being able to hear, versus very long extended food supply chains, much more vulnerable. So all that is to say that this notion here is that there is an element of decentralization that is core to resilience, but also as we can, by networking it, get some of the efficiencies that we often pursue by trying to have these sprawling geographic networks here.
Great, thanks.
We got a half a dozen questions in the chat box, so I'll try to go through these because we've got about 15 minutes left. So, and obviously, because there's so many smart people here like you, these are not, 1 minute questions or 1 minute answers. But with resiliency being a shared public-private sector responsibility, is there a best practice of a regional collaboration initiative to address this vast undertaking?
Well, something we actually have going right now in response to the COVID emergency in New England is something that's being driven by FEMA Region 1. Was really quite impressive. One is they started planning for recovery at the same time they were dealing with response. This is something I've been making a case for a while. We should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We tend to think about these almost stovepipe ways of prevent, protect, respond, recover. And the response folks are basically usually often clear out of the way, we're here for the life safety, and then somebody else will figure out how to get the thing recovered afterwards here. What the challenge here was, of course, is that the COVID-19 public health emergency required all those emergency managers to focus on things like ventilators and PPE and testing and so forth. But the state's economic and community development arms weren't all that busy. And they're pretty smart about economic recovery. So the key was partnering with the economic and development arm of the state to start that recovery planning process. They, in turn, had a lot of access to the private sector, the chambers of commerce, the various regional planning, things that are economic, who, again, were largely just sitting back on their heels because we had the COVID emergency and starting to mobilize that. The key is looking at who are the players who, on the blue sky days, are in the conversations about economic development and economic recovery, or on efficiencies, and how do we get those equities of resilience as a part of those conversations, versus just trying to shove it down people's throats post an event. That often doesn't work so well, and especially if it's just the emergency managers or others who are trying to make the case, because they may not have it as communicated as well. So there are lots of other instances, but just as the key here really is thinking about this as an organic, ongoing thing that you have to do, and it should be therefore a part of every private-public kind of conversations that are being set up right now, both pre an event or post an event.
Great. Well, which strategies are most effective at making to make resilient infrastructure that is resilient to multiple threats, not just SLR or flooding, but also wind and human disruption? Is it really redundancy rather than design that can address that, or are there designs and other best practices that can help?
Yeah, it really is all of the above, and so it's a great question. The key with what I call a resilient-centric approach versus a hazard or threat-centric approach is you start first by understanding the lifeline system. Well, what is the critical function that it provides, and how does it provide it? And that again gets at the elemental capacity, produce the function, and then the basic function that has to be there to the essential function rather that's there. An essential again is enough to support recovery as well as provide lifeline support for the others who are dependent on it. Based on that, there's certainly designs that we want to put in place that are able to support the system to be able to ideally provide that function, but also that notion of cushionability again, design it to fail gracefully. And the most resilient design is one that actually has a regenerative ability post being knocked down to actually come back. Versus, oops, it failed, so I got to stop. I start all over again. So we actually know it will probably fail under an extreme event. If over its life cycle, there's a reasonable probability of that happening, I want to design it to fail gracefully. And then also have the built-in means to repair it. So again, I don't have to start all anew and absorb all those costs.
I think that also goes to the point about we're not fighting the last war. It's not the last disaster that we're fighting. We got to be ready for the next one.
Very much so. And also because, this, of course, very much the case in the maritime realm. When we're talking about capital assets that have a 40-year, 50-year plus, or if it's a Coast Guard cutter, probably 100 years from our experience. You have to build in you're faced with uncertainty no matter what when you're trying to anticipate the future. Building in the means for your system to basically be able to adapt with a more intense hazard as that evolves, have the means to essentially upgrade it, to modify it over its life cycle. Again, versus throwing all the dice down, either overbuilding it because you're worried about the worst case scenario over the, let's say, 40-year life, or underbuilding it, hoping for the best. What you really want to do is build into the system that if at 10 years, the thing you're worried about looks like it's going to be more forthcoming, can you upgrade it? Can you modify it to deal with those risks? So these are why the engineering sort of systems perspective is so critical to actually getting to resilient solutions.
So how do you balance adding those incentives that you talked about of baking in resilience against the ever-lengthening time to propose, finance, and actually build that ship? You know how long, or that piece of infrastructure, how long it takes to get the funding cycle and then the construction cycle.
Yeah, the real key element of it here is to look at the full life cycle of the asset, of the system, and then be able to take into account that risk factor over the course of life cycle versus, well, it'll be fine for 2 years. If I can offload ownership to somebody else, I'm willing to take essentially a greater degree of risk. One of the areas we're looking at is beyond trying to just to get to essentially the standards bodies to advance these requirements, but is to actually get to where where finance happens, which is built around ratings. So if I can get the finance raters to essentially say, because you haven't adopted these mitigation measures, your capital costs are going to be much higher. Because what I can see is the overall value of what you're producing, the way you're going about producing this, is making it an asset that's not likely to make it through its life cycle. Our challenge, we talked about insurance a little bit earlier, most insurance products are written for typically a year and are renewed. What that allows the insurer to some extent is to walk away from a bad product if the risk goes up. And if it creates a sort of short-term mentality, you're shopping around for the lowest cost insurance. The insurer is basically compressing the window to a year. So where we see more activities in the reinsurers, the insurance companies of the insurers, are the ones who are holding that risk. And they increasingly, these are the Lloyds of London, the Munich Re's, the Swiss Re's, they're starting to say, now hang on, before I buy up this pool of risk, I actually want it to incorporate these. So again, we're looking at not just insurance in isolation. You can't insure, you have to insure against standards that are well accepted, that pass a muster here. You've got to have the financial markets bought in on that as well, and that's often done through ratings and cost of credit and cost of finance. All those pieces have to be brought together to get us to a better place.
Great. Well, I appreciate that, and we got about 3 more, about 8 or 9 minutes to go. So let me go through this one. With the cascading effects of events at the systemic level, what are the best constructs for inducing collaboration multimodally or jurisdictionally to accept and share the costs of resiliency beyond their own fence lines and political boundaries?
Boy, that's a great question. It's a really challenging set of issues. Again, as I really highlighted, the challenge we often face with resilience is because we're dealing with complex interdependent systems where each system often has its own different geography. As an illustration, as I talk about in the city of Boston, the only thing that the mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, has direct control over as a critical lifeline infrastructure is wastewater. There's a wastewater treatment facility on Deer Island. You know, you see when you fly in over to Logan Airport. That's it. Boston Water and Sewage has that. Water, on the other hand, comes from a reservoir 70 miles outside the city, gravity-fed through 13 small communities that show up in Boston. Power comes from Hydro-Quebec, is where it's generated, and is transmitted down across, Vermont and New Hampshire, Maine, so forth. So you start to see the challenge. It's not even, so when you say, right, Mr. Mayor, you got to do something about making your infrastructure more resilient, the core challenge is, well, all the people who actually provide those functions aren't in his control. And they're not even in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They're not even in New England. They're across Canada. So it takes actually agencies, I will have to make a pitch for my own agency and yours here, agencies like the Coast Guard, who actually aren't so bound by the geography, the jurisdiction of the city or the state, that have a regional presence, can play pretty good at convening these kinds of things through things like area maritime committees and others. This is really pretty cutting edge because it turns out on the waterfront, you have everybody there. You got transport and logistics, you have energy, you have often you have to deal with tourism and hospitality and all the rest of it with crews and so forth. So there's a natural convening of the maritime, particularly the port, if the port looks beyond the waterfront. And that's really important that it does that. Because the waterfront itself, the piers and the facilities is not where this action is. Those infrastructures are tied outside the port, but it's a natural center of gravity for bringing that together. The other key here is using essentially the gaming. And what we've done in Boston was to take Hurricane Superstorm Sandy and just march it north and just say, well, if this happened here, how would it play out? And that's what some of the slides I shared you were animated for that. To essentially not look at, boy, that was really too bad, New York. Anyways, we'll get back to business as usual. But hey, what happened there could happen here. So the core is regional convening. And also, every time we have a disruption, a major disruption, we find a way to cross-pollinate those lessons learned in a way that animates, ideally, this level of collaboration. But somebody's got to step up. And I think in some cases here in the maritime realm should take a lead. The Coast Guard can certainly play a key role, partnering also with universities that also can bring people to the table is another smart way to do it.
Well, thanks, Stephen. And we got time for one more. And I think there is a comment in the chat that I commend everybody to about a comment about supply networks, not chains. And I think that's a great comment. But the last question I'll give you, and this is obviously something that always matters when it comes to measuring and metrics and things like that. I think we have to remember the mission and not be overly focused on the metric. But if you don't measure it, it becomes an issue. And the question is, how should we quantify maritime resilience? How do we quantify that? What work is being done to develop an applicable resilience theory and the models within the maritime realm, which should be a pretty big softball for you at Northeastern and what you're doing right now?
Yeah, well, certainly that is where we're heading toward. The good news is there is lots of mechanisms to begin to quantify this. The core, as we talked about here with resilience, is it really is about assuring continuity of function. So when we talk about the maritime, the fundamental function is mobility, right? But not mobility of often key resources like energy resources and food supplies and so forth, and that has a value. And so if you can measure here, if I lose a portion of that function, what is the cost and consequence of the loss of that function? If it's acceptable over a temporal period, a time of 3 days, I can live without because I can surge back pretty quickly, or 5 days, or 7, or whatever it might be. You can start to do these cost-benefit analyses, but you start first by valuing the function. Let me highlight an example of not so good story here, really, that came out of Superstorm Sandy. This is where sometimes the myopic focus on response can actually disrupt recovery.
is the Coast Guard has its protocol for managing a port disruption, which is post the storm. First, you close the harbor first. Secondly, go out and check if there's any debris in the water. You can check the aids to navigation, and then if you give it all clear, it's safe to move on the surface. Good to go. Well, the challenge with Sandy was that we needed fuel desperately because the entire liquid fuel supply system had knocked out. The pipeline got knocked out. Refineries are knocked out. There are 100 barges of fuel waiting for the Coast Guard to get through its. What you would want to do here is say, look, let's get the damn barges in. Let's find a safe way to do that. We can't restore the function for the whole port, but what we can do is realize that energy has to be bought into at a certain threshold. Otherwise, the cost is not just in terms of dollars and cents, but actually in terms of lives. So if you focus on function and you look at through this scenario-based approach here, what the various losses are likely to be and start to quantify that, that hopefully informs what you might do on mitigation up front. Is that a appropriate investment? And if you can't mitigate, what can you do to accelerate recovery post-hand by being better prepared to that response and recovery piece? Because you could make up for loss in recovery. And again, another example of that is shutting down, as we increasingly do in the Northeast, is the highway system in advance of, for all non-essential vehicles, in advance of the blizzard or the snowstorm coming in. You're giving up some function, but you're doing it because you know you can clear the roads that much more quickly when the storm clears to recover more function. And so you're thinking through those trade-offs. And again, these things are quantifiable, not easily quantifiable, but happily have the tools of network science that are coming to bear here. Artificial intelligence is helping with us. The real race is to update our thinking about taking on the systems approach.
Well, Steve, thank you. And we are regrettably out of time because I know that we could go on for quite a while. But I just want to thank you for teeing this up in such a way and really giving us that opportunity and that springboard into increasing our thinking. And I think that really is key to as we go forward. So in closing, let me say thank you, my friend. I appreciate it, shipmate. Give my best to Joanna and Christina. Please give me, and we will look forward to seeing each other again soon.